Good evening, weary traveler, and welcome aboard the train. Tonight, I'll be your conductor, so sit back and settle in. Today's trip will take us through the tale of the Highgate vampire. So without further delay, let's journey forth on the Express to the Void. In 1965, people traveling through Highgate Cemetery began to report sightings of ghostly figures throughout the cemetery. The main ghost sightings was that of a woman with long white hair searching for her murdered child and a skeleton standing at the main gate. In July 1965, the sightings began to morph. Brian Bourne was walking his dog when a chilling and unnatural stillness fell upon him. Bourne would look up and see a black liquid substance flowing down the cemetery wall. Then a masculine shape materialized out of the liquid. Bourne is quoted as saying there was no face. Where eyes would have been if it were human, there were just two red pits, red glows. This wasn't a ghost, this was an entity. It was simply not human. Brian Bourne's dog began to growl at the figure before being pulled away by its fleeing owner. By March of 1969, reports started piling up for the British Psychic and Occult Society, talking of sightings of a tall black apparition roaming around Highgate Cemetery. At first, these reports were passed over as local gossip. But soon the Society's investigation would lead them to a man claiming he had had a first-hand encounter with the Highgate vampire. He claimed that he had been stalked, then hypnotized by something following him in the dark. Wandering around the Highgate Cemetery in a daze, he felt the unnerving presence of something behind him. When he turned to look, he claimed a tall black figure was standing there, before suddenly vanishing. Others would make claims of the dead rising from their graves or blood trails that lead into mausoleums. Then an elderly woman came forward, saying she was also startled while walking her dog in Highgate by a tall, dark man with glowing eyes. At this time, it should be noted that Highgate Cemetery had fallen into disarray since World War II. Originally built in 1838, many of the plots had been filled with notable people like Karl Marx and Douglas Adams, the author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The graveyard boasts it is home to 170,000 corpses. With a primarily stagnant client base, this made for a horror film-esque setting with old stone crypts and crumbling grave sites. I know we're not too deep yet into our story, but I would like to take a little detour to really lay down the atmosphere of the Highgate Cemetery with a tale from 1626. The story revolves around an English statesman, whose name is Sir Francis Bacon. On a snowy cold night in January, Sir Francis Bacon was traveling to Highgate with one of the king's physicians when he suddenly got an idea. For some reason, Sir Francis Bacon liked to experiment on different ways to preserve meat, and while traveling through the snow, he came up with a new idea. What if we used the snow to preserve meat? Sir Francis Bacon and the king's physician were so excited by this idea that they immediately abandoned the task on hand and rushed to a nearby poor woman's cottage. There they bought a chicken off the woman and ordered her to butcher and clean it. Once finished, Sir Francis Bacon would take the bird's corpse and fill it with snow. For whatever reason, shortly after this, Sir Francis Bacon began suffering from an extreme chill and was unable to travel. His health began to worsen as he sat in a damp bed until about 3 days later when he died from pneumonia. Since his death, there have been multiple spectral sightings of a white bird resembling a plucked chicken running around in circles in Highgate before disappearing. One account by aircraftsman Terence Long is that after crossing Pond Square in Highgate, he started to hear the thunderous clatter of a horse carriage. Then everything went silent before an ear-piercing chicken squawk was heard. Suddenly a ghost chicken appeared, running aimlessly around before quickly disappearing again. The ghost chicken sightings continued up until the time of our story, which is what we will get back to now. Hope you enjoy the rabbit hole of the legend of the Highgate ghost chicken as much as I did. But anyways, back on track. After receiving a large influx of reports, the British Psychic and Occult Society decided to take a deeper look into Highgate. But up until this point, they only had eyewitness accounts to go off of. That was until the dead foxes started to show up. The bodies of foxes start to appear in the cemetery with deep lacerations on their throats and their bodies drained of blood. The local newspapers began to write articles about the strangeness happening in Highgate with titles like, "Why Do the Foxes Die?" The press would also come to the conclusion that this must have been the work of vampires and the occult being active in the cemetery. Now it is time to introduce you to one of our main characters in this story. David Farrant was a member of the British Psychic and Occult Society and took the head of the investigation into the Highgate vampire. At first, David would dismiss the claims that this was the work of a vampire. Instead, he believed that the foxes may have been trapped and used as a sacrifice in a dark magic ritual. It didn't take long for him and fellow society members to change their minds. After doing follow-ups on reported sightings, David and members would begin to also claim to have come across the Highgate vampire and seen the apparitions for themselves. David Farrant would write in the Hampstead and Highgate Express that he had evidence of vampire and satanic activities taking place in Highgate Cemetery. As the story began to gain momentum, David Farrant and the society members began to receive requests by television shows to talk about what they had encountered. The other society members would refuse the offers, stating that they were forbidden from giving out any details about an ongoing investigation. David, however, was more than happy to talk about what he had witnessed on TV. David Farrant would later try to drum down the impact of his statements in a book he wrote, Beyond the Highgate Vampire, saying that he purposely avoided using sensational terms like vampire when speaking with reporters. At this time, our second main character would also appear giving interviews about his take on things. His name was Sean Manchester. Sean Manchester was a self-proclaimed exorcist, vampire hunter, and bishop of the Catholic Church. He also claimed to be the descendant of Lord Byron's romantic relationship with a servant. Sean Manchester had been investigating this supposed vampire since receiving reports 2 years prior from 2 teenage girls who had been walking along Swan Lane and reported seeing the dead rising from their graves. He had recently come back into contact with one of the girls. She claimed to still be having nightmares of the events 2 years prior and had fallen ill. Whilst talking with her boyfriend, Sean Manchester would be told of 2 small puncture wounds found on her neck. He decided that the girl was under attack by a vampire and gave her a silver cross to wear. He also hung a crucifix and garlic in her room before giving her a linen necklace full of salt, sprinkled holy water, and prayed with her boyfriend. Surprisingly enough, the girl soon regained her health and was back to normal. Another incident that Sean Manchester said he experienced was with another local woman. A woman named Louisa said that at night she felt like she was being suffocated and had 2 small puncture wounds on her neck. She would also commonly suffer from sleepwalking, and once during one of these episodes, Sean Manchester was alerted by her sister. The two of them would follow Louisa, who wandered to Highgate Cemetery. She gained entrance through a broken railing on the west side of the graveyard and walked to the columbarium. Louisa then stopped and tore her crucifix from her neck. A loud booming sound was heard and Louisa collapsed to the ground. Sean Manchester and the sister Anna would carry Louisa back home. But when she awoke, she didn't remember any of the events that had unfolded. Now, if David Farrant was reserved and careful to avoid sensationalism when talking about the Highgate vampire, Sean Manchester was his exact opposite. He would tell reporters while holding a wooden stake and crucifix that they were dealing with the king vampire, and was quoted as saying, "The method to exorcise a vampire was to first drive a stake through its heart. With one blow, chop off its head with a gravedigger's shovel, and burn what remains." Sean Manchester would claim that he and David Farrant were teaming up to rid Highgate of this creature any way necessary. In reality, Sean Manchester and David Farrant hated each other and would constantly argue about the narrative of the Highgate vampire. The broadcast of the Sean Manchester's interview would air on Friday the 13th in February 1970. The following nights, hundreds of people would show up armed with wooden stakes and shovels to help out with the vampire hunt. Ironically, Sean Manchester would not show up for this hunt, perhaps scared off by the size of the mob he had created. The police had also arrived and blocked the angry townspeople from entering the Highgate Cemetery and destroying the place. However, once people breached the police blockade, it was nearly impossible to stop their rampage. Graves were thrust open and their occupants drugged out, then had spikes driven through their chests before having their heads removed. Others from the horde would wander around the cemetery looking for the king vampire before fleeing the graveyard in terror. They would soon go on TV in an interview with the London Evening News, saying that they had seen something crawling in the dark. Anthony Robison is quoted as saying, "I walked past the place and heard a high-pitched noise. Then I saw something gray moving slowly across the road. It terrified me. I've never believed in anything like this. Now I'm sure there's something evil lurking in Highgate." David Farrant would fight back against these claims, stating that it had been caused by mass hysteria due to the reporting done in the news earlier. He also didn't believe that the hauntings were even done by a vampire and blamed Manchester for all this madness. An editor for a local paper that published many of David Farrant's and Sean Manchester's back and forth said that they mainly continued to report the feud of the two simply for a laugh. The two grown men, however, didn't seem to think what they were dealing with was a laughing matter, and believed what the other was saying was only aiding the vampire and was going to get somebody hurt. Things would go eerily quiet at Highgate until August 1970. Two schoolgirls were walking in Highgate when they stumbled upon a 100-year-old corpse of a woman. The body had been drugged out of its coffin, decapitated, had a stake run through its chest where the heart would have been, and left abandoned in the pathway. The police began to investigate, and a new wave of vampire sightings began to appear. One report from a woman says that she had been shoved to the ground while in Highgate by a tall, pale man in black. David Farrant, troubled by these accounts, decided that they must act to finally put an end to the Highgate vampire. He and fellow society members gathered in the cemetery to conduct a seance saying, if successful, A rite of exorcism could then be performed to banish the entity from the earthly plane. On August 17, 1970, David and Society members would make their way to the initial sighting spot of the Highgate vampire. There, they began the ritual. They drew a large circle on the ground, sealing it with protective symbols, salt, and some holy water. They then drew a second circle and placed burning candles and incense around it. The second circle was where the vampire was meant to appear. As the seance got underway, a voice could be heard off in the distance. Soon the voice got closer and closer and louder before revealing that it was the police. David and the members of the society tried to make a run for it, but were soon captured by the police. David Farrant was jailed in 1974 for grave desecration for several years. While he would deny these charges and any wrongdoing, he would admit to sending 2 of the police officers voodoo effigies, which he filled their heads with stuck pins. After his arrest, the media would start making claims that David Farrant was a cat killer, writing that he had sacrificed a cat in front of 2 virgins to gain power. When Sean Manchester was asked to comment on this, he would claim to be the better man, saying, "My opponent intends to raise a demon to destroy me by killing a cat. I will be relying solely on divine power." David Farrant would later sue and win against the newspaper for spreading these claims. In 1973, Sean Manchester claimed that he found the vampire of Highgate and drove a spike through its heart while at the nearby house of Dracula. But David Farrant and Sean Manchester's rivalry didn't die with it. The 2 of them continued to go back and forth with one another for the next 50 years, hitting high points like the time they challenged one another to a magical duel on Parliament Hill. They even went as far to print flyers advertising their duel, telling people to arrive on April 13th. Their battle to see who was the mightiest wizard was also once again picked up and reported in the local newspaper. While this battle ended up never taking place, the 2 continued to squabble with one another. At some point, rumors began to spread that David Farrant had killed Sean Manchester in a magical duel in France. This time with a sword rather than his wizard powers. Ironically, David Farrant would claim that these rumors were actually created by Sean Manchester himself, who circulated photos of his fake dead body so that he could raise funds, claiming it would be used to have his body shipped to Glastonbury for internment. Obviously, Sean Manchester was not dead, and it is unknown if he made any money from this scam, but it was believable enough that David Farrant would be visited at his house by the police investigating the murder. Sean Manchester would write a book in 1985 titled The Highgate Vampire. David Farrant would refute this book with his own book titled Beyond the Highgate Vampire in 1991. David Farrant would also go on to make a comic series called The Adventures of Bishop Bonkers, where the idiotic main character was a not-so-subtle nod to Sean Manchester. The comic would gain enough popularity that Farrant was even able to sell merchandise of it. In 2002, Sean Manchester, when asked if he'd have an on-record conversation with David Farrant, replied in the third person that Bishop Manchester announced that he would not engage in any program, project, or debate that includes the interloping charlatan and self-publicist David Farrant. The fighting would finally stop when David Farrant passed away in 2019. He had still been fairly active in the news media up until his death. One of his last public statements in a local newspaper was in 2006 when claims came out that he was hosting Halloween orgies. He is quoted in response, "I've been accused over the years of being many things by the media and others, including a sex-mad witch ad infinitum." Little side note. But after getting out of jail, David Farrant would go on to form the Wicca Workers' Party and would be the sole candidate in Hornsey. The party ran on ideals such as pro-public nudity, free sex, the restoration of the Wiccan Creed, the establishment of state brothels, outlawing communism, and leaving the EU common market. In 2013, Sean Manchester would retire from public life, claiming he wanted to spend the rest of his days in creative contemplation. Apparently, if you ask workers at the Highgate Cemetery, they refuse to talk about the Highgate vampire. But it is not surprising, as it has been a large source of the continued vandalism over the years. After David Farrant's death, Sean Manchester wrote a eulogy on his website once and for all, burying the hatchet. He wrote, "I am enormously saddened that he went to his grave without knowing he had my forgiveness. We shared a warmth uncommon in close friends, never mind sworn enemies." Impressive, traveler. You've made it until the end. Seems like this tale wasn't enough to shake you from your seat. Perhaps another ride sometime may leave you shattered. But until then, please get off the train